Hello and welcome to Xamarin University. My name is Adrian Stevens, and today we're going to talk about master detail and drawer navigation with Xamarin Forms. We'll start by exploring the UI components that Xamarin Forms provides for drawer and master detail and learn how to decide between these two presentation patterns. Now, drawer navigation and master detail are terms that are often used interchangeably, and the differences may seem like a personal preference, but it turns out they do have different uses depending on both the data that you're displaying and the device types you're using. So let's see when to use each one and decide which style is appropriate for our application. Now let's define the terms we'll be using in this course, and this is important to clarify meaning, but also make sure that we understand the terms as they apply to the Xamarin Forms API. Now first is drawer navigation, and this navigation pattern consists of an off-screen piece of UI and typically is shown by pressing a menu button, commonly referred to as a hamburger icon because of the three horizontal lines. Now the user will make a selection, and then the menu is dismissed and the relevant content is shown. And it's very likely that you're using apps today that use drawer navigation. Now next we have master detail, and this UI presentation pattern displays a list of items, typically on the left side of the screen, and then details about the selected item on the right. Users can tap a selection, and the detail area is updated. Now in both master detail and drawer navigation, we define two content areas. The master is often thought of as the menu, and it displays two or more selections, and detail shows specific information when the user makes a selection. Now we're using this specific terminology for both drawer and master detail because that is how it's represented in the Xamarin Forms API. And we'll use a common coordinating page type. This is a master detail page, and this will manage the interaction between the master content and the detail. Now more specifically in Xamarin Forms, the master detail page exposes a master property and a detail property, both of which must be assigned page-derived types, and typically those are content pages. And this master detail page is specifically designed to implement both master detail and drawer navigation. Pretty convenient. So at this point, you're probably thinking that implementing these two patterns they're fairly similar, and you'd be right. In Xamarin Forms, we control the visibility of the master to change the UI presentation, and we use the term split when the master is always visible. And we'll use the term popover when the master is displayed as a drawer. Now again, this terminology is used by the Xamarin Forms API, and you'll see that in just a moment. Now the master detail page has a property called master behavior, and this is what we'll use to control the master visibility, really switching between master detail and drawer. Now the master behavior property is an enumeration type with the same name, and as you can see, there are several options allowing us to control how the master is displayed. Now in Xamarin Forms, setting the master behavior property is not the only factor that determines the UI presentation. The behavior can be overridden depending on the device type, and for some values of master behavior, the presentation can change between portrait and landscape. So on phones, the master detail page always uses popover behavior, regardless of the master behavior setting. This is true for all phones, regardless of the size and regardless of orientation. One more time, on phones, you will always get drawer or popover behavior. And this actually makes sense because phones typically have smaller screens, and we want to leave more space for the detail content. For every other platform, the behavior is consistent. So let's start with a default value for master behavior. When a device is in portrait orientation, the master will be presented as a popover. And when the device is in landscape, master and detail will be split. So this tries to make intelligent use of screen space, picking the right style based on the available horizontal screen space. Now next is popover, and with this setting, the master will always be displayed as a popover or drawer. and split similarly ensures a split presentation. Now the next two are interesting. Split on landscape uses a split presentation when the device is in, well, landscape. But in portrait, it will use popover. So notice this is the same as the default setting. And then finally, they're split on portrait. Now this setting will ensure split is used on portrait. But what may not be intuitive is that the setting will also use popover on landscape. Now you likely won't use this setting unless you're doing some further UI customization for each orientation. So with all of this, which should you choose? Well, if your goal is drawer navigation, you'll choose popover. For master detail, you'll most likely use split or split on landscape, or you could just leave it as default. And keep in mind that you'll still always have popover behavior on phones, regardless of the setting for master behavior. Now let's learn how to perform drawer navigation. And in this section, we'll learn what's required to create both the master and detail content, and then use the master detail page to coordinate between the two. Now, some applications have multiple top-level pages, which can be challenging for navigation. We probably don't want to use stack navigation here because that means that users will have to backtrack all the way to the root if they want to change sections. Now, tab navigation might make sense, but we have 5 sections here, and if we add any more, it's really a lot of content, and it's too many for tabs, especially on smaller screens. It means we'll rely on that overflow behavior, and then the navigation becomes cumbersome for our user. So let's look at drawer navigation, and we've already talked about this, but we'll go into a little bit more detail. Now again, in our drawer navigation, the UI displays a master list of items, typically on the left, along with details for the currently selected item. And this pattern works really well for applications that need to provide the ability to switch between several different pages of content. And our conference app is a great example. We'll have several sections of content that are all different types, but they're all important to the user. And so really the benefits here are random access, if you will, to the details of the different pages of content. All the pages are fairly discoverable by the user since they're all listed in our drawer. And the navigation UI doesn't take up valuable screen real estate, and that's especially important on our smaller devices like our phones. Now, as mentioned earlier, we'll use the master detail page to perform drawer navigation in Xamarin Forms. So we'll need to provide the UI for the master area and provide a detail page for each section in our application. So let's start with the master or drawer UI. The master UI is provided as a page, and this is typically a content page. Now it's up to you to decide what specific UI elements to use and how they'll be arranged, really just like any other content page you'll create. Commonly you'd use a grid or a static layout that contains buttons, but there are no restrictions on which elements or layouts you can use here for the master. Now there is one specific requirement. You must set a title on this page. Otherwise, you will get a runtime exception. Now for the detail UI, you'll most likely provide a unique content page for each section of your application. And again, what you display is up to you. It's just a content page. So now that we understand the pieces, let's go through the steps to build the complete drawer navigation UI. So we're going to first create our master detail page derived class. We'll assign our master content page to the master property. We'll assign a default detail page to be displayed by assigning it to the master detail page's detail property. And if we're supporting Android, we're going to need to wrap the detail page in a navigation page. And then we assign an instance of our master detail page to the app class's main page property, so it's in the visual tree. So we'll start by creating a master detail page derived class, and we'll give it a reasonable name. Now this class can be C# only, since the actual presented UI is contained in the master and detail sections, and there's generally little to no benefit to defining anything in the XAML here. So just create a new class and derive from master detail page. Next, we'll assign an instance of the master page to the master detail page's master property. And then assign a default detail page to the master detail page's detail property. Now this is required. If you do not assign a default page, you will receive a runtime error. And if you're supporting Android, you're going to need to wrap your detail page instance within a navigation page. And the reason for this is it will provide a navigation bar. Now, when running on Android, if your detail page does not have a navigation bar, the default drawer menu icon won't be shown, making your master page difficult to access and substantially less discoverable. Now, although only required for Android, it's pretty common to always wrap the detail page content in a navigation page, regardless of the executing platform. And to display your master detail page, you're going to create an instance and assign it to your app class's main page property. Now, your master detail page should always be the root page of your application. It shouldn't be hosted within another navigation page type, such as navigation page or tab page. It should always stand alone and be the root. And nesting the master detail page within another page is not supported, and it may give you unexpected results. Now, natively, Android and Windows UWP support drawer navigation. And these are default navigation paradigms on the platforms. And this means that Xamarin Forms uses complete native controls for these platforms for our drawer navigation. Now, on iOS, drawer navigation isn't provided with UIKit, and so the Xamarin Forms team had to build a bit of custom UI. Now, most of this is completely transparent to us as developers. However, we are required to provide a menu icon to access the drawer on iOS. Now, for Android and UWP, the default drawer icon is used. Now, we'll add the icon to the master detail page. This can be done either in C# or if you created that XAML partial class, it can be set in XAML as well. Now, the master detail page displays our drawer and detail content, but it's our job to update the detail content when the user makes a selection. And the detail page has no specific knowledge of the master page, so it's common for the master detail page to perform the coordination. Now, the user makes a selection, the master will notify the master detail page, and then the master detail page updates the detail content based on the user selection. Now, there are no requirements on how to perform the notification, but it's common and a good idea to expose an event on the master or on our drawer page. Now, since the master detail page holds the instance of that master page, it can subscribe to the event and respond appropriately. And to indicate which selection is made, we use an enumeration, and this is to keep our code as readable as possible. Now let's go through the specific steps. We'll create the enumeration, we'll publish an event from our master page, we'll subscribe to the event in our master detail page, we'll update the detail page when the event fires, and then we'll dismiss the drawer. Now the enum is straightforward. Create an enumeration that describes each page. Now this will allow the master page to notify the subscriber without needing to pass a complex object. Then in the master page, create an event that passes your enum. You'll raise the event anytime the user makes a selection, and then of course include the appropriate enumeration value. And then in the master detail page, we subscribe to the published event and we get notified whenever a user makes a selection. And notice this is just regular old .NET C#. Now when the event is raised, we update the detail content by assigning a new page to the master detail page's detail property. Notice in the code here, we're using a switch statement to check the enum value passed by the event and then instantiating the appropriate detail page. And then we pass the desired page into a new navigation page, which then gets actually assigned to that detail property. And finally, you're responsible for dismissing the drawer. Now this is done by setting the master detail page's isPresented property to false. Now note, isPresented is only intended to be assigned if the master page is displayed as a popover. Now for some values of master behavior, such as split on landscape or split on portrait, if you assign isPresented when the UI is split, it will throw an exception. So we recommend in these cases to wrap the assignment in a try-catch block, and alternatively you could guard by checking the device idiom and orientation. Now keep in mind that if master behavior is set to popover, as you may do for drawer navigation, this try catch is unnecessary because of course it will always be displayed as a drawer. Next, we'll use the split presentation style to create a true master detail UI. Now in this section, we'll adapt our new master detail page knowledge to present an actual master detail UI where the detail page is shared among all the items in our master collection. Now, apps commonly need to allow users to explore data collections and view details about the items in that collection. Now, contact or email programs are great examples, but we can be exploring many other types of data. Now, master detail or split UI is optimized to allow users to browse and examine a collection. We use a list for master, and this is because we're browsing collection and we may not know how many items are in the collection until runtime. And because we're browsing a collection of items of the same type, we only need to define a single detail page. The same page type can be used to represent any item in the collection. And we prefer to use split view when possible so users can quickly switch between items. Again, this may not be possible on smaller screens. Now we'll implement our master detail UI by creating, you guessed it, a master detail page derived class. It's the master detail page's responsibility to coordinate between the master and detail pages. And similar to drawer navigation, we'll expose an event on the master page, and that gets raised when the user makes a selection on the list. And we recommend that the event just pass back the index of the selected item, which the master detail page can then use to update the detail page or the detail content. Now, creating a master detail page requires several steps. First, we'll create our master UI and expose the selection event. Then we'll create a detail page and code the data loading logic. We'll need a master detail page derived class, and that will coordinate the master and detail pages. And in our master detail page, we'll choose split as our master behavior. And finally, we'll add the master detail page to the visual tree by assigning it to our app's main page property. Let's start with the master page. The master page is a content page that needs to be able to display a collection of data and allow the user to make a selection. And a list view is the perfect control type for master and is typically used. As before, there is one specific requirement. You must set a title on this page, otherwise an exception will be thrown at runtime. We'll also expose an event that is raised when the user makes a selection. So look at the code here. At the top of the class, we define an event that returns an integer, and we subscribe to the list view's item tapped event. In the item tapped event handler, we raise our public master item selected event, passing in the ID of the selected item from our collection. Now let's talk about the detail page. This is just a content page, and it's entirely up to you to design the UI for this page. And here we're using a stack layout and a couple of labels, but you could include any Xamarin Forms elements that you like. Now, because the detail page will be used for all items in our data collection, because it's a homogeneous collection, we need a way to tell the detail page what data or information to display. And a good pattern is to pass in the ID of the data that you need to visualize, and then your page or view model will access your business layer and retrieve the model for the given ID. Now here you can see a call to the static getById method on the planet data class, which returns a planet model object. Now, the implementation details will depend on your data and of course depend on your business logic, and it may and likely will vary. But we're just talking about data presentation with C#, and there are many other possible solutions. And next, we'll create a master detail page derived class. And this is very similar to what we saw in the drawer implementation. And again, notice we're assigning our master page to the master property, and we're assigning our detail page to the detail property. And in this case, we're passing in a default ID of 0. And you see we're subscribing to the master page's master item selected event. When it's raised, we'll update the detail page using the ID provided by the event. Now, we want to choose one of the split options for our master detail display. Now remember, this applies only to non-phone devices. The behavior will always be popover on a phone. And just like drawer, we assign an instance of our master detail page to our app's main page property to add it to the visual tree. And again, don't nest the master detail page inside another page type or navigation type. It should always be your app's root page. And this brings us to the end of our course today. Thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully you've got a really good understanding on how to implement drawer and master detail navigation in your Xamarin Forms apps. And be sure to check back at university.xamarin.com for more great mobile, .NET, and Azure courses. Bye for now.